Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. I really appreciate being here with so many other colleagues and for the discussion that we'll all have after this as well. So I wanted to turn the focus further into thinking about farmers. And so we're talking about practices and policies around climate adaptation and mitigation in agriculture. But of course, central to that topic is farmers themselves. And most of my research focuses on understanding human behavior and food systems and policy design and implications for that. I'm excited to be back here at UC Davis, where I actually did my own PhD working with Mark Lubell in environmental science and policy, and was a PhD student in ecology. And most of my work at that time, as it still does today, focuses on understanding farmer behavior and factors affecting adoption of various practices. So today I'm going to largely cover what farmers think about climate change. What does the research, my own and others, tell us about that? What factors affect adoption of climate adaptation and mitigation practices? What are the practices that farmers have adopted or want to adopt? And finally, what this means for policy design and opportunities moving forward in this space. So, as we all know, most likely, agriculture is both a contributor to climate change and a potential victim of its impacts. And clearly, farmers are a critical component of adaptation and mitigation practices. And here in California, as well as other places around the country, we've only seen more and more extreme weather events add up and affect agriculture, both in the United States and globally. We're also seeing farmers innovate and enlist things like drones to think about drought and other innovative technologies as well. There's also a large body of research, especially exploring agricultural adaptation. So this is a paper published by Deborah Davidson in 2016, which was a review of agricultural adaptation research. And you can see there is a large body of research focused on farmer surveys, especially in low-income countries, though there has been a focus in high-income countries as well, which is where the majority of my work has focused. In the United States, we actually have quite a lot of research over the last decade or so. A 2017 review paper shown here suggests that there has been distribution of understanding farmers' perceptions of climate change and their behaviors around climate change actually in all USDA climate hubs around the country. And the same paper suggests that there are a variety of factors affecting climate behaviors. And I want to add that this is Chatrichan et al. 2017. So this framework presented in that paper demonstrates that mitigation and adaptation can both stand on its own, but also overlap, and that farmer decision-making around climate change is a function of a variety of different factors, ranging from belief and perceptions, to knowledge, to capacity, social networks, environmental factors, and finally, political and economic factors as well. So I'm going to use this framework to present some of my own research as well as others with regards to what we know about factors that affect climate behaviors among farmers. So to start with belief and perceptions, what we know from this review paper that I've mentioned is that the majority of U.S. studies show farmers believe climate change is happening. According to the Chatrichan 2017 et al. Paper, on average, they found 65% of farmers across many studies that they reviewed believe that the climate is changing. This has been covered in the popular literature, such as through Scientific American and many other studies over the years. But that same paper review article also suggests that fewer farmers believe in the anthropogenic nature of climate change, only about 40% on average across these studies. That is notable in part because of mitigation. And so if a majority of farmers do not acknowledge the anthropogenic nature of climate change, there may be less willingness to engage in mitigation practices, for example. However, some of our recent research suggests that these may be changing. And this work is forthcoming, but it's, as far as I know, the first study in the US that has tried to understand the shift in farmers' perceptions over time, looking at some of these concerns. And so from two different studies, one conducted in 2011 in Yolo County and one conducted in 2017 in Yolo County, you may, of course, know that there was a large drought in California during that time period or in between those two time periods. We found that climate change belief shifted from 55% to 70%, and that human attribution for climate change belief shifted from 35% to 45% agreement. So there are evidence suggesting that these continue to evolve and change, just like the public's perceptions do, especially with an increasing incidence and extreme events over time. I'd also like to posit research that we have in review right now for my graduate student, Luis Alexis Rodriguez Cruz from the University of Vermont, suggests that we may also be at a belief threshold in some cases that could affect adaptation and mitigation practice adoption. So from our work in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, we found overwhelming evidence that farmers believe in climate change and also believe that it's happening now and that the risks are extreme. So 94% of farmers that we surveyed in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria believed the global climate was changing in 2018. And that was similarly high rates of human attribution for that. And our research that's in review right now suggests that when you have such a high level of belief in climate change, those beliefs no longer seem to matter in terms of whether or not someone adopts a practice because so many people actually acknowledge the problem. So as we see more and more extreme climate events, this research would suggest that moving forward, whether or not farmers believe in climate change will become less and less of an issue, and it will be other factors, including capacity and structural institutional factors that may limit their capacity for changing practices. So moving on to capacity, there's quite a lot of work exploring how perceived and actual capacity of farmers affects their adoption of adaptation and mitigation practices. And when we think about capacity, we're talking about a variety of different kinds of capacity, including financial, technical, human, and psychological capacities. In research that we published a few years ago, what we found was that farmers' perceived capacity was the only predictor of both their actual adoption of climate mitigation and adaptation practices, as well as their intended adoption. So whether or not they felt they had the capacity to implement changes. There's also recent research from Gardesi and Arbuckle in 2019 from Midwest farmers showing that perceived capacity was positively associated with cover crop use. And in our 2016 article, we talk about the importance of perceived capacity and fostering this sense of capacity and confidence for people to be able to change their behavior. And this may be especially true for climate change, as there is a sense of powerlessness that has been associated with climate change, especially because it is a collective action problem. And so the individual belief that you can make a difference is sometimes really challenging. A third component of factors that have been shown to affect adaptation and mitigation behaviors is trust in information sources. And there's a growing acknowledgement that agricultural knowledge networks are increasingly complex. You know, this traditional idea that farmers receive information from cooperative extension or from a top-down sort of university model is increasingly no longer evident. And so in research that I was part of back in 2014, where we put forth an Extension 3.0 concept, we were arguing that agricultural knowledge systems are usually two-way streets, and that social networks reinforce belief systems, and belief systems can reinforce in social networks, and program participation can also affect all of these outcomes as well. I would also argue that our research previously has shown that the number one type of person that farmers are talking to about agriculture are other farmers. And so there is a lot of social learning and social networks occurring within farmer networks themselves, as well as with outside actors. Research does show that, agricultural industry and farm groups are those that are most trusted by farmers. And some recent research that a graduate student I'm working with here at University of Vermont has found is that farmer group participation is positively associated with some of these potential co-benefit adaptation and mitigation behaviors, including no-till adoption on New England vegetable farms. Environmental factors are another one of these that can affect how farmers think about adaptation and mitigation, or their willingness to adopt different practices. So Mace et al. Has shown in research across the US that farmer perceptions of risk were the most important for adaptation practice adoption. And these perceived risks appear to be increasing in some places like California. So that same research I noted previously, where we surveyed farmers in Yolo County, but both in 2011 and 2017, also found a significant increase in the perception that farmers had about whether or not climate change presents more risks than benefits for agriculture in the county. So we saw a significant increase, which you can see here. 2011 are the dark bars, and 2017 are the lighter bars. And you can see the percent of farmers that strongly agree and agree somewhat significantly increased over that time period. So as we do see more and more extreme events, as farmers do start to recognize and experience more and more of these risks, it's likely that these will continue to shift their interest and their likely adoption of adaptation and mitigation behaviors. And finally, I want to touch on political and economic factors that affect adoption of practices. And this has been a strong focus of my research for many years. And this quote is one I come back to a lot, even though it's 8 years old at this point. But a farmer in 2012 told us they felt confident they could adapt to climate change. They weren't sure they could adapt to the legislature. And our research has shown, both in California farmers and beyond, that the political and economic aspects that can affect mitigation and adaptation practice adoption for farmers is very significant and incredibly important. So from research that we published in 2013 in Global Environmental Change, we were able to show that farmers' concern for climate change here in Yolo County among farmers in the county was actually highest for economic and regulatory climate impacts, as opposed to water or temperature related impacts. In that same survey, we also asked farmers about their interest in participating in a government program for climate mitigation or adaptation, and only 48% indicated any interest at all for actually participating in a voluntary incentive program for adaptation or mitigation behaviors. I think those results highlight a potential need for simplicity as we think about how farmers think about regulations and what impact that may have on their willingness to engage in certain kinds of practice adoption. So we've been working to understand farmers' perceptions of policy and regulations in Vermont and California. And our data suggests from the last 2 years that over 80% of farmers in California and Vermont think government regulations and paperwork have increased in the last 5 years. You can also see here in this graphic from data from Vermont that the level of complexity perceived by farmers of government regulations has also increased in the last 5 years. And so this suggests that there may be opportunities to think about policy design, both for regulatory or incentive-based programs, that may more completely align with some of the challenges farmers perceive of the regulatory process. And as we think about some of the current policies that do exist, a key question that I think we should be asking is how effectively are we enabling farmers to understand what their options may be for payments for ecosystem services or adoption of climate mitigation and adaptation programs and practices. So this is data from California surveys that we did in Yolo County in 2017, and then in Fresno, Madera, and San Luis Obispo counties in 2019. And what you can see here is that for the majority of both state and federal programs, that farmers are just simply not aware that these programs exist. And then even when they are aware, which is the orange bars here, that they're not intending to participate in these programs in the future. And so I think this highlights really importantly that, first of all, let's make sure that we're using all possible avenues to encourage adoption, which could be possible through some of these existing programs, but also to understand why farmers may not be familiar with these programs and what opportunities we have to better understand and help them adopt and understand these different issues. Of course, one key question that you may be thinking about, that I've certainly been thinking about, is do we even need the government? You know, a lot of the current practices that we're seeing that are being adopted are really ones that are being driven by industry efforts and other emerging groups such as Indigo Ag. And so there are a lot of new programs coming online that mostly do not involve the government, and we are seeing farmer uptake of those, though not at significant levels. But industry encouragement and mandate of different practice adoption, or allowing farmers to be paid for additional practices, is certainly something that is emerging as an option as well. And finally, I wanted to add that I think it's important that we recognize that there are other factors for adaptation and mitigation. So in recent research that we've done here in Vermont and also in Maine with farmers, we did a study to look at and model the mental models, how farmers think about their farm system and what's important for them, compared to how extension and agricultural advisors think about farm systems and what's important to them. And what we found was that farmers were much more likely, as they think about their farm system, to mention aspects of community well-being, quality of life, and farm success as compared to outreach professionals, as well as environmental stewardship. And so as we think about farmers adopting practices, I think it's very critical that we consider the potential impact of those practices both on farmers' quality of life as well as community well-being, which may be forefront for them, as well as their farm success. So to wrap things up, I wanted to highlight as well what kinds of practices are we really talking about here. And this is based on some of my own work as well as other research across the U.S. about the types of practices that farmers are most interested in. Recent work from Mace et al. In 2017 found that the majority of kinds of practices that farmers are interested in for adaptation include conservation practices, crop insurance, and technologies. Our own work in California has shown a suite of different practices that farmers said they would be likely to adopt in the future, both adaptation and mitigation practices. On the mitigation side, you can see that a lot of this has to do with electricity usage in farm operations, nitrogen use efficiency, but not nitrogen use reductions overall, as well as fuel efficient farm equipment, conservation tillage, and other alternative energy issues. On the adaptation side, a lot of these were focused on water that we asked about. And I'd also like to highlight that, at least when we asked these questions several years ago, not all of these practices were necessarily good for sort of the public per se, but may have personal benefits, such as pumping more groundwater, for example. Although I will add that when we resurveyed farmers in 2017, this likelihood to adopt this practice significantly dropped, as we have seen a drought and the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. But overwhelmingly, we do see an interest from farmers in thinking about these practices. But I think it is important to think about that, not all of these have co-benefits, first of all, or even public benefits. And in my own work, we've seen definitely that farmers are more interested in adaptation practices as compared to mitigation practices. And there's a lot of interest in payment for ecosystem services and this idea of paying farmers rather than regulating farmers as well, that I think is important to consider. And so some concluding thoughts. What do we know? Well, we know a lot about farmer perceptions of climate change. We also know a lot about potential factors that affect adoption in the United States as well as in other parts of the world as well. We know less about sort of the mix of co-benefits across different kinds of practices and how that potential mix of co-benefits would actually affect farmers' willingness to adopt those practices. We're not understanding the complexity, I think, of the situation as much as we could. I think in terms of policy design, our research has shown that many, if not most, or the majority of farmers don't necessarily want to participate in government programs for a variety of reasons. And so in light of that, what are the opportunities to bring in non-government partners, trusted advisors? What are the opportunities for regulatory versus incentive structures to encourage adoption as well? So I look forward to our conversation. I want to acknowledge my co-authors as well as funding that I've received for a lot of the work presented here, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.